Hello and welcome to the NEA Big Read, Central Florida. I'm Carrie Watson. I'm an assistant professor of art history at the University of Central Florida and the director of the UCF's Big Read programming, an initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. The NEA Big Read broadens our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of reading. A great book brings people together, and it is critical that we maintain those connections, especially in times like now of crisis. This year, we were excited to partner with Seminole County Public Libraries and the Veterans Legacy Program to offer programs in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the publication of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Published in 1990, The Things They Carried is a collection of short stories based on the author's own experiences as a soldier in the 23rd Infantry Division during the Vietnam War. Inspired by the book, this series of talks asks artists to consider how they respond to crisis and to think about the ways in which the arts respond to war and trauma. Today, we're pleased to welcome Jave Yoshimoto, an assistant professor of art at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Jave's laser-cut wood relief sculptures and monumental paintings address what he calls the social amnesia of the information age and asks audiences to see themselves in the faces of those who are displaced by war and disaster. And thank you for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jave.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Thanks to UCF and this whole Big Read program. It's really an honor to be here. As you are very aware, we're in this very strange times, and it's nice to be able to connect to people in any way possible, really. So it's nice to be able to have this platform to really talk about art and talk about connecting, and in this case, talking about war and conflict and what artists do to really respond to these tragic, dramatic times. So I'm just going to jump right in and share my screen with my PowerPoint in. Just to contextualize my talk a little bit, I'm going to talk about my personal motivation and how I got into art making, and from that point, how I shifted from more personal space to more like viewing a more generalized big picture kind of situation. So I will talk a lot more about towards the end how I address issues of conflict, war, and how that relates to my personal conflict. So here we go. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, so my name is Jave Yoshimoto. Very quickly, I'm Chinese, Japanese-born Chinese American. My parents are Chinese, and they immigrated to Japan when I was a kid, and I was born there and raised there until I was about 9, and I came to the States. So there's this a lot of mixed identity and a lot of this idea of transition displacement that I address through my own work, because I'm trying to basically resolve my personal conflict about my personal identity. So that's kind of how I addressed a lot of some of the things that I work through in my work. I'm just going to jump to my college. I went to undergrad at UC Santa Barbara, and I made works about social issues early on. I did all dumpster diving. I recovered a lot of broken items, restored them, and then tried painting on the surfaces to try to break away from traditional rectangular painting space, and then more like a sculptural and also illusionistic space to talk about different issues. In this case, one I talk about domestic violence, but I've talked about homelessness, international relationships, and things like that. And when I was done with my undergrad studies, one of my friends told me this line, "Art making is an egocentric act." It made me wonder what that meant. I couldn't quite prove this guy's argument wrong, that it is a self-serving, art making is a self-serving act, that it's all about you and not about anything else, anyone else. So it kind of put me on this track of trying to figure out, well, what more can art be? So past undergrad, I went to grad school in School of the Institute of Chicago to study art therapy. And initially, it was me working in hospital settings and working with people with different mental illnesses. and eventually I would work in nonprofit organizations to work with different populations. But when I started, my mother passed away, and I had to deal with a lot of my personal trauma. And to deal with that personal trauma, I went to the angle of trying to work with humor. So one morning I was sitting in artist residency, and I saw this piece of a strip of bacon. I thought it was the most beautiful thing, and I need to bring joy into my life. So I decided to paint bacon for a short while. I made about 25 different bacon paintings in different sizes, different mediums, just so I could bring some joy and humor back into my life, so I could bring myself back up from this place of really dark point of being depressed, and then trying to be more functional again. So those. For me, art making was also a healing tool, not just a tool to help others, but also a tool to help myself, but also kind of a way to meditate to understand what art making can be. So towards the end, I did finish my graduate studies in art therapy and work with nonprofits organizations to do a process called the studio process, which is a combination of writing and art making techniques to create work in a very safe space. And that taught me a lot about what art making is, what art making process is, what kind of healing aspects and learning aspect it has, the self-reflective aspect, and how it can help others, but as well as myself. So when I was done, I really wanted to pursue painting for myself again. So I went to grad school in Syracuse University, and I wanted to really hone down on a particular topic. Up until this point, I kind of struggled with my personal cultural identity, being an Asian American, being a Chinese Japanese American, and I always felt like the hyphen between the words rather than a particular identity. So I was looking back at my experience growing up in Japan, and something that really resonated with me was when my mother used to work night shifts, I used to just watch TV, and I would watch Godzilla movies. And whenever I watched Godzilla movies, it was always in conflict. He was always walking around, he's being attacked by the locals, the other monsters, and so on. So I imagine Godzilla to be the most loneliest guy in the world. And that's a feeling I could personally relate to, because wherever I moved to, I always felt like I was being attacked by stereotype or racism or whatnot. So Godzilla became a very interesting symbol for me to work from. But I had this starting point, but I also needed to really think about my content as far as like aesthetics. So I referred to my cultural heritage, being the Japanese and Chinese. I looked at Chinese propaganda posters. I looked at Japanese with block prints. And so the aesthetics really drew my eye, the flat colors, the bright colors, the simple, yet very beautifully balanced aesthetics, with block prints. It's also, inspired by other artists such as Banksy, who is basically a master of juxtaposition and being able to combine elements together to tell a story. But historically, I was really drawn to artists like Francisco Goya, who made art about his times, and read about capturing about humanity of the times that he lived in, the tragedy, the injustice. And so I didn't quite get to this point early on, but you'll see how my work changes and comes closer to the way Goya addresses his contemporary time. So in my some of my early Godzilla series really was addressing about my personal conflict, about my relationship with my mother, and how I had living in a very physically and mentally abusive situation, and how I needed to escape, how I wanted to find a place where I can be safe and be myself and be heard, and not being able to have that safe space was really a struggle for me. So this is my way of visually addressing some of the conflict that I had internally. Eventually, when I went on with the series, Godzilla became less and less important as a subject matter. And I realized that I was really just observing the world for what is happening and what has been happening. So this particular painting from 10 years ago, it's about the BP oil spill in the Gulf Coast, and how helpless I felt looking at this diabolical beauty that was happening in the water, how it's affecting the sea life, how it's affecting the local pelicans, and how it's affecting the locals trying to clean up this mess, who all eventually came down with cancer for trying to clean up all the oil spill all over the Gulf Coast. Then again, I was making personal references to some of my experience, having grown up in Japan, having grown up in the US, I was a big consumer. So this is kind of very much tongue-in-cheek composition about how I love shopping and how I love consumerism and how ashamed I am of it at the same time. So in this case, it's again the reference to the Chinese propaganda posters saying that I adhere to the ideology of consumerism. Every single one of my favorite stores are listed here, like say a Chinese restaurant or electronic stores, department stores, thrift stores, dollar stores, art supply stores. Whereby I blow my money, basically, you name it, is all kind of depicted in a symbolic way here, and how it's very much of a celebration of me just to enjoy myself in a very shameful kind of way, but also kind of made to everybody, yeah, this is something I'm ashamed of, but I love it at the same time. I bring this piece up because, again, due to the internal conflict, but this is where it gets interesting because this will affect the way I make my laser cut way down the line than I realize. And because this is a digital drawing, I have an output that I'd be able to put it out in a way that I haven't been able to do in paintings before. With a painting, it's usually like a one-off. I make a painting, I'm done, but with digital drawing, there's no original, there's no final result, right? So I can do whatever I want with it. So this original drawing was about 10 feet high by 20 feet wide, digital drawing wise, but I can do an output as a physical object where in this case, I spray painted a block of wood and I reversed engraved the lighter areas onto this piece of plank wood to kind of make a reference to the homage to the wood block prints earlier. But and so this process would come in later on. Before I was done with my grad school for the second time, I heard this news of the earthquake in Japan on March 11, 2011, and I was very struck by this news about how tragic it was. It was an earthquake with a magnitude of 9.0 earthquake. It triggered a giant tsunami that swallowed up the northeastern part of Japan. This is the city of Sendai. And it triggered a project that to this day is probably the biggest project that I've ever done. It's a large scroll painting on paper done with gouache paints. It's kind of like a watercolor, but it's more of a matte and bright, really bright pigments. And this is something that I took about 328 days to do. And it started at a residency in New York called Art Students League. And I was basically working on this large roll of paper. I thought it might be about 10 feet long, but eventually the director came and said, you got a 30-foot long piece of paper, why don't you paint the whole thing? So I basically said, challenge accepted, and just decided to really tackle it on. And as I said, it took a really long time to finish. I was really borrowing a lot of free different images from Google searches and really just collaging the compositions I went from right to left. And when I decided I need to make a more accurate rendition, I did this grid style illustration to basically draw freehand these type of drawings and then really color it in bit by bit to finish the painting. So, my studio setup was sort of like this. I had 2 doors and 4 sawhorses. I had a van at the time, so I just kind of threw everything in the back of my van and traveled with my painting wherever I went. It took me about, I started in New York. I painted in Vermont. I painted in Nebraska, painted in Chicago. Wherever I could find space to paint, I would go and make art. And so, again, 328 days later, I was able to finish this 30-foot long scroll. As you can see on the floor here, that's the completed piece. And these are the details. So the rings you see in the background here are the 9.0 magnitude earthquake. You see a whirlpool. That's where all the boats, houses, and whatnot get sucked into the bottom of the ocean. Moving towards the left, here you see USS Abraham Lincoln, which is the very first ship to arrive to provide assistance, food and whatnot. You can see the waters coming onto land. Here is some mudslide that's happening, houses collapsing, nuclear facility from Fukushima exploding in the background, the roads collapsing. You can see the fire happening in the refinery. And there's the image of a mother who lost her child, which I thought was a very powerful key image, which is why I want to do that more of an accurate depiction of that particular photograph. Here's a rescue scene of a helicopter, basically rescuing all the different people who are trapped under the rubble, and here are the volunteers coming in to rebuild for the future. So again, 320 days to complete the pieces, but also at the same time, I knew that I wanted to do more with my painting. So what I did was I brought my painting to a blueprint company, and with their help, I was able to scan this painting. It took about 16 tries and 3 hours of trying to scan this thing, but I was able to scan the whole thing, and then was able to print reproductions of this, which we once I had a show at New York City at our Students League in New York. We had a one-day show. We sold all the prints, and every single penny from the sale went to a nonprofit in Japan, where it was helping kids who are recovering from the trauma or the disaster to really help heal from the trauma, right? So as an example, initially, the kids who came into these art classes really, they were just drawing black and white circles. They had no expression on their faces, but eventually they kept coming back, and they kept drawing. They were able to start drawing with more color. They were able to smile again. So the healing process was something I was able to contribute to. So that made me feel good about this whole process of making and sharing art. Then I visited Ground Zero, where the tsunami hit. This is basically what's left of the town, right next to the beach. As far as the eyes can see, all you see are foundations of the houses. The nearby elementary school is where the locals escape to and watch their homes get washed away on the rooftop. And when I was driving around, I see really tall, rusted, rubbles like this. It's about, the picture doesn't really do it justice. This is about 3 feet high. I mean, it's 3 stories high of a rusted material that had nowhere to go. So it was very impactful for me. It left me a very powerful impression. And that basically kickstarted my disaster series, where I made more of a compact version that I can show around a lot easier. This is about 41 inches wide to 30 inches high. So much more compact, a little bit smaller, or a lot smaller, I guess. But it still had all the key elements of the scroll. You had the 9 rings, you had the whirlpool, it's got the water coming in, mother and child, volunteers coming to rescue and rebuild. So all the important symbolism from the original scroll is in this particular piece. Then I moved down to saying, okay, where do the debris end up? And they usually ended up in the Pacific Northwest, near Seattle, Portland, Vancouver area. So all the things that's depicted here are basically everything that washed up. The motorcycle washed up near Portland, the boat and the soccer ball near Vancouver. The soccer ball at the bottom right, it's actually interesting because they had the original owners, the kid's name and address was on the soccer ball. So the Vancouver couple who found the soccer ball was able to ship it back to the kid in Japan, and it has a nice full circle story to that. So I thought it was important to capture that aspect. So as the painting series went on, I became more and more about other things. So I didn't want to just focus on tsunami, but I wanted to focus on really what I'm doing and what's happening internationally. This is 2013, the Syrian conflict beginning, and I remember hearing about the government using chemical weapons against its own citizens. So this is kind of like where U.S. was considering whether or not to bring in airstrikes and be involved in the war. So this is kind of like a war games type of reference here. And other conflicts, and this is really a conflict, I guess. This is more a personal conflict. This is a piece about the Faroe Islands, which is in between Denmark and UK, and it's a tiny little island in the middle of the ocean. And their practices is that they would lure all these pilot whales into the so when the pilot whales are washed upon the beach, they are massacred by the locals. This is more like a family event. It's kind of like a 4th of July here in the US. But because it's an island, they celebrated these fishes because they provided food and they provided fuel for the island. So it's more like a tradition. But I do question the humanity of all this that's happening. So up until that point, one of my biggest challenge was that I was relying on other people's images. In 2015, I received a grant from Joe Mitchell Foundation, and they basically asked what I would do with the money. So I proposed that we got to find out more about these particular topics, and I'm researching and actually go over there to really take my own pictures, collect my own stories, and make work based on that. So my first research was to go over to Nepal and then seeing how the earthquake damaged the country, how people were suffering, people were buried underground, and people had to be rescued. And it was a very hard thing to see. And with people being rained upon because it was during the monsoon season. And it was a very difficult thing to see. People had to live outside and doing aftershocks, and it was very unfortunate. And the story that really affected me the most was this village of Langtang. This was before the earthquake. This is the village of Langtang after the earthquake. It is survived by one person who was just out grocery shopping for his wife. He had about $7 worth of money in his pocket, and he came home to nothing. So stories like this really was touching and really affected me deeply. So I went to visit Nepal, and these are the pictures I've taken, watching people rebuild their own homes brick by brick. And I met a woman on the left here, Manika Rai, who along with her husband went up to villages up in the mountains where there are no roads, you just have to hike up there. And their houses are in shambles. So they basically recruited American architects to help build houses, design houses that are that uses local source materials like these broken pieces of houses here to build something that can take the sway of the earthquake. So it was really nice to see stories like that where people can come together to help each other in times of need. And my second project was going to research about the refugees, the Syrian refugee crisis, where the millions of people were basically leaving the country. This is no statistic in 2015. At the time, 3.8 million people were leaving the country through different routes across the world. Some went through the south to go to Jordan, some went to Iraq, some went to Turkey to go through to different islands, Greek islands, to get into Europe. For me, my focus was on Lesbos Island, which is an island just 10 miles south from Turkey there. And people were basically leaving, basically paying a lot of money to the human traffickers to get on these dinghies so that they could cross the waters and try to survive. But they usually land on very rocky surfaces, and they have to hike from the top of the map of this island here to the bottom right of that red city of Mytilene, which is about a 14-mile hike in a very windy mountain roads. And they're not allowed to get help from any volunteers because anybody who helps them will basically get arrested for human trafficking. And people basically have to make do with what they have, stay where they can, sleep where they can, try to get on the bus, get into the mainland to get to Europe. But again, old statistic here, 12 million people affected back in 2015. And then when I went, I volunteered in the village of Oskara, which is at the top of that map. Small fishing village of about 300 people. And they were actually nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for wanting to help the refugees. I volunteered with the Swedish nonprofit called the Lighthouse Relief, where we were doing watch duty, and we also were landing duty, helping people, get to land, put on dry clothes, provide hot meals, and get them ready for transition to the next camp where they get registered for asylum status. But usually people are stuck for about 2 years, and all the discarded life jackets end up in the middle of the island. But there are nonprofits, organizations there who helps the refugees, like say the Mosaic Art Center in the city of Mytilene, where they get these discarded life jackets and create these materials to sell to volunteers, to tourists, and really training the refugees to some job skills in exchange for language classes, like English classes, Greek classes, and so on. So they get to really be involved and interactive, but they can't receive money. So that's part of the tough thing, because everybody had to live on very small amount of money, and just don't know when they can actually leave the island. So when I came back, I started creating compositions like this, really the human migration of people basically driven out by the conflict that's happening in their own homeland. Innocent lives being lost in the sea. And while I made pieces making references to like local Greek mythologies, this orange here in the border is the actual life jacket refugee that from a refugee that I brought back to the States to use as a part of material. And this particular piece is based on the local mythology of a scholastic media about the Virgin Mermaid who helped sailors cross the sea. In the legend, she's known to have a trident in her hand and the boat of the boat of the sailors in the other. So I reimagined the Virgin as a refugee woman helping other refugees cross the sea to safety. And this kind of talks more about the conflict. On the left side, you see Vladimir Putin talking with President Assad about the conflict in Syria, driving out and forcing the migration of people. Here, the refugee woman and the baby is basically represented as the Virgin Mary and Jesus, sort of, and there's like a symbolism there, because again, making reference to local iconography, aesthetics of the art in the region. Goddess Eos on the right, bringing the blanket over, volunteer helping at the bottom right, and so on. So a lot of narrative based on the different symbolism and reference to local times. So shortly after finishing that painting, I injured my arm, and I decided to go into laser cutting because I could still do mouse clicks. So painting was hard, but digital drawings I could still do. So I would turn my drawings to digital formats, and then I'll make different slices. It initially started out as me basically reproducing my paintings and gluing the layers together so I can have this relief type of sculpture. And I was able to make a lot of pieces rather quickly because of the digital drawing process. And I was able to start traveling to different parts of the country, visiting different schools. In this case, Las Vegas. I was building a very large piece here. And then I was able to visit Ohio University out east and really collaborate with a student to come up with the design for one of my pieces. In this case, the frame for the piece. And then we were able to collaborate and build the pieces together and really show and share my process so that the students will know how to make it themselves if they wanted to. So again, reproduction of a painting from the earlier times. But eventually, again, I'm talking about all the different issues around the world. In this case, it's about how people are destroying the world. This is the large piece that you saw a few frames ago. And again, reproduction of my paintings, but this is about 4 feet wide by 5.5 feet high. So a very large piece for me. And basically, again, initially making these type of references to the older paintings, but eventually I was able to start making my original designs based on my experiences. And this is me volunteering in the kitchen, helping to make more of telling the story of how we were making hot meals for the refugees and the volunteers being tired in the background, and with the local Orthodox priest singing a song for us with the Cadence Lab. And stories shared to me by other refugees about how they had to pay different amounts of money to cross the sea to safety. In this case, they had to pay 100 euros, which is about $110, just to buy a life jacket, and paying 1,000 euros just to get on the dinghy, which may or may not float. So it's a very hard thing to hear when I hear these stories, and that's why they inspire me to make pieces like this. And also making creative frames for these compositions so that people can feel like they can get involved. Like in this case, it's like, it's almost like a game, right? Where I'm asking you to be proactive, be helpful, be, assist, volunteer, donate. And capturing a life of a refugee inside one of the camps in a tent, just waiting on the islands, completely crowded, overpacked, not knowing when they're going to move on next. And yeah, so again, different calls to action is basically what I'm trying to address with my pieces. This piece is about the earthquake in Nepal, and as you can see, the village of Langtang is up top. The earthquake in the center of the composition, and also the border being shut down from India to Nepal to allow them to get fuel, fresh water, and supplies that they desperately need because of political conflict that's happening between India and Nepal. And then I was also driving across the country a lot. This is me driving around in Wyoming and coming across Powell, where the former concentration camp used to be, and how that was very personally effective for me as an Asian American. And I want to create a piece that's based on that history. And also noting that some of the racism, blatant or not otherwise, are being shown on internet as well, where in this case, Walmart was selling posters of Japanese internment camps for $210. So I thought that was a very interesting thing to make a composition out of. And then I met a couple in Colorado whose aunt was in the internment camp herself. And so this is an actual picture of her eating a slice of watermelon at the camp with all the different life happenings in the background. And then the conflict also comes on our soil too, where contemporary times when, immigrants or refugees are trying to cross the borders and 3-year-olds are being put on court for entering the country illegally. This is going to go back to the refugee here. He is one of the successful refugees that actually made it across to Europe. And another piece about conflict where people are in the world of ruins and trying to make a normal situation out of a crazy world. And then this is about New Orleans, where children are being affected by the lead contents in soil. And how about a war on drugs, where OxyContin or the different heroin is affecting city folks, and addiction is a huge issue in the country right now. And this is again a reference to the earlier piece. Same thing, people trying to make a normal situation out of a crazy world. Right here in Nebraska, last year, when the freezing of ice and sun melting of the ice caused massive flood across the state and killed off all of the cattle. Again, immigration situation and how we address some of the children being incarcerated. And this will be the last slide here, but I made this piece in the format of cell phone because people are always asking for help. They call for help. Will you answer it? Will you ignore it? And that's how I'm addressing in this particular piece. The orange and red at the bottom is again from a refugee life jacket that I kind of turned into almost like a blood drip looking thing. So that is my talk. This is just a little notation for any art students. What does it mean to be a practicing artist? Things to practice, such as create a digital archive of all works, have an artist's resume and CV, biography and statement, have an elevated speech ready to explain the works, learn to write about works that are constantly evolving, create and maintain a website, social media page, support fellow artists and promote them. It comes back full circle. Establish works regionally, nationally, and locally through the artist calls. Save receipts for all art-related expenses for tax purposes. Have an art hero, both dead and alive, to look up to. The property pack and protect works. Do not be a jerk, very important. Nobody likes a jerk. Have an attitude of gratitude for any opportunity that you get. Choose a topic of passion and follow through. Practice mindfulness and self-awareness. And my conclusion, art making is an egocentric act. As it is difficult, if not impossible, to create something that does not involve the self. However, it can be a catalyst for serving the larger picture and the greater good. A tool of introspection, self-awareness, and connection with other people. Art making is an opportunity to start a dialogue and conversation on things that are poignant in contemporary times in today's world. And so thank you very much. I appreciate my time here. If you have any questions, please send it forward and I will answer them. Yeah.
Thank you, Jave, so much for a wonderful talk. And thank you for the message to students. I think that's really great to always remind our students and artists about kind of those practical aspects. Your work really responds to current events and acts as a call to action for viewers. And I was curious, I read an article yesterday about the use of language that we would use to talk about war. Right now, that's the language in the media that's being talked about as well. We're fighting the pandemic, we're on the battlefield, we're going to the mountaintop, and we're fighting. And I was curious about that war metaphor in the current crisis, and also if you're making any work right now that is dealing with these current events.
I am actually. I think from my lens, it's always about from the angle of empathy and also compassion. So I'm making a couple of pieces. One is about the nurses who's in the front lines doing these hard work. And the other is, I guess, about what it's like for certain people in our community who's having a hard time really getting what they need to get. So I'll do another quick screen share just to show you what I have. Yeah, it won't take too long. So that's the current imagery I'm working with about a person trying to shop, but there are no supplies left on the shelf. And yeah, so that's the current my current project, if you guys can see. Yeah, anyway.
Do you feel like when you're making this work, it's helping you personally? I think that we're all, you know, suffering in this trauma. Of course, the people on the front lines and the people who have the disease much more so than the rest of us. But for all of us, I think we're having this separation from our normal daily lives. And so you had talked about art therapy. So how do you feel like making this work? How does it work for you, operate for you, I guess?
Well, I guess I'm trying to be meditative about and being present, being aware about all the current situations. And it is traumatic. It is pretty hard. So me being able to make these works that helps me with my personal trauma, I suppose. But hopefully I can make works in a way that's relatable, that people can actually feel what I'm feeling as well. This is the time that we're living in, and this is how we're reflecting, and this is how we're trying to deal with the situation the best we can. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what the end game is so as far as like when my compositions are complete, but yeah, it's just my way of addressing my personal trauma as well as other people's as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Sure.
sharing your work with us today. And I think that's so true, right? The world we're living in and how we make art that responds to it. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks.